I'd like to officially introduce Dr. Mary Stewart, who is the CEO of Energetics. Mary has played an important role over a number of years as a technical and financial advisor for business and industry at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Energetics is an Australian leading specialist consultancy in energy and carbon management. Formerly the firm's chief operating officer, Mary took up the position of CEO in 2019. A chemical engineer, she is globally and locally recognized as an expert in climate risk and energy management strategies. Her colleague, Anita Stedler, unfortunately couldn't join us today, but we thank her for helping to put together today's presentation.
So what I'm going to try and teach you or talk to you about today is how to unpack the language that people usually use when they're talking about how they finance renewable energy projects. If we can move on to the next slide, please. And I will say, embarrassingly enough, living in Australia, my connection is not necessarily stable. So if I go offline, I apologize. Energetics works across the breadth of the challenges associated with decarbonizing the economy, as well as working with companies to try and understand what a changed natural environment means to them. We've been doing this for 38 years, and we've got some really deep insights. Moving on to the next slide, please. And the slide pack will be made available to you more because it's a source of information than because you need to go through everything, just so that you know that both Anita and I come from South Africa. Anita's background is in Stellenbosch, and she ran part of Barclays Bank that looked at financing infrastructure projects through Africa. So she has a deep understanding of the challenges of running big projects through the African continent. My background is in the mining sector. I've worked extensively with the South African mining sector. And even now, my clients include BHP and Rio and a number of companies that operate off-grid sites through Africa. So while we've both been in Australia for a while, we stay current with a bit of what's happening. Can we move on to the next slide, please? A lot of why I thought there was value in talking about this came from a conversation I had with Fiona, I'm going to say about 2 months ago. So as you've been told, I do represent the business and industry group as one of the negotiators in the UNFCCC process. And what really came home to me, the first thing that I learned that was a startling fact that I haven't lost, is the price or how much money that has to move to bring about the change we need to have happen is huge. I mean, 523 trillion American dollars is not a number that I can comprehend. But what was startling to me was it's going to come 50% from the private sector and 50% from government. A lot of the money that you see coming into Africa is, as you were indicating, Tabor, it's German government money, but on a global basis, 50% of this change is going to be paid for by the private sector. And we're going to see increasingly hybrid business models that aren't just about government grants and about development bank money, but we're going to see hybrid models of private sector financing driving the change we need to see through the global energy system. And that's why I thought there was value in talking to you about the subject today. But you need to understand a bit about renewable energy projects so that you understand typical stages of development. And then we'll look at financing across the life cycle and how do you measure success? What does a good renewable energy project look like? If we've got time, we can look at the South African case, but given the announcements that were made 48 hours ago, what's happened in the REIT project is going to change because the rules of the game have changed in South Africa. I think there might be more value in moving on to the discussion, but let's see how we go. Let's move on to the next slide and on to the next one, please. So just so that you are across what we're talking about. So generation is when you raise your electrons, you then distribute it through the network. Typically there's a retail arm of the generator that actually sells the power to you and it gets to the customer. In this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on wind and solar and grid scale wind and solar. There are some real challenges with biomass, and I'll happily talk to you about the biomass project that you've raised, Sharon. But in the context of this project, we're talking about grid scale wind and solar, because there are specific business models and there's specific ways that people finance these and typical ways that people make money out of these projects. So moving on to the next slide, please. So this is a typical life cycle of a renewable energy project. There's early stage development. You find out where you're going to put this in place. You see what resources you have available, how much cash you need, what skills you have on the ground to do the maintenance of the project, and you start engaging with the community and looking at your environmental assessments. So just picking your site and getting it ready takes 1 to 3 years. Then you go into the development stage. You'll see that in blue there is secure an off-taker. You need to know who's going to buy your power. If you don't have an off-taker secured, you're not going to pass development stage. So that's one of the real gates that you've got to have, is to make sure that you've got an off-taker who can pay for power at the price that you're going to be producing it. And that's probably a question for the project that vanished, is was there an off-taker and could they pay the price that would be charged for it? It's also when you've got to get your network connection sorted, and I know that a number of renewable projects in Southern Africa have had problems with getting access to the grid. It's where you come to financial close, so it's where all the parties are in agreement as to what they're going to pay and how it's going to be supported. And then typically you have someone who does an energy performance contract, so he actually manages the kit. You then build, so it can take 3 to 5 years to get the development and actually get the details of the project knitted out. Construction, actually building, takes 1 to 3 years. At the moment, the supply chains are interrupted, not only because of COVID, but for example, there's a global shortage of computer chips, and that's what you use to control your wind turbines. So in some instances, my clients are being told, if you haven't ordered your kit now, you're going to be waiting 5 years. So that construction stage at the moment is taking a very long time. You then commission. You've got to make sure you're not going to trip the grid when you connect. If you have a problem with your technology, it can take years. And then you typically operate these assets for between 20 and 30 years. So you've spent 3 to 5 to 7 years getting the project to work, and then it sits there and hopefully generates money for 20 to 30 years. And then there is some removal and the closed loop recycling of the technology. Moving on to the next slide, please. So looking at what I said, that off-taker is critical to your project's success. Where we are in Australia, where we have a tradable market in electricity, there's a number of different people that buy because of the structure of the electricity market. So they're government auctions, and this is typically how power is sold in Africa, which is the governments buy what you're producing. In Australia, you get corporate off-takers, so you get companies who arrange the development of renewable energy projects so that they can buy directly from the power plant, even though it's sending the electricity through the grid. And then there's electricity retailers who do just sell electricity. So they typically buy from the generators and they sell to the public. So there are different people that you can look at to buy the electricity that you're producing. Next slide, please. So looking at how these projects are typically funded. So the first is a pure play developer, which is someone who will go through the choosing of the site and getting it through the development. And as soon as it's constructed, pretty much they sell it down. So all that those companies are doing is developing renewable energy projects and then moving on. You get the passive asset owner who builds it, but then they'll start owning it and retain some interest or some equity in the project through its life cycle. I've put the active asset owner and the vertically integrated retailer in grey because the structure of the Southern African energy markets means that that's not possible for those types of business models to take place. So in an active asset owner, they carry on owning it, and they're the ones they've delivered very, very tailored projects that meet their own needs. They've taken all the risk so that they can get higher returns out of the project. The developer, the pure play developer, takes a lot of risk, but they price that risk into a premium when they sell the asset. And so quite often those pure play developers are selling to off-grid sites like someone like a mining site. So those are that's the continuum of business models that companies can take when they're looking at building, owning and operating the asset. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So how do we see the financing moving across the project lifecycle? The next slide has the same stages as we spoke about before: early development, construction, commissioning, operation and decommissioning. So in the early stage development, we quite often see developers. So I'm going to talk about debt and equity. Equity is when someone lends you money, and in exchange for that money, they get a part of your project. So they buy a piece of your project for the money that they give you. And they expect to get that investment back through getting some of the income from the project during its life cycle or through the sale of the project. A debt investor is someone like a bank who lends you money for a home loan. So you take out debt and you've got to pay it back from the money that you get during the operation of the project. So in early stage development, a developer can take out equity. In other words, they put in a whole lot of their IP and a whole lot of their time in developing the project, and they retain part of the project. You can get technical advisory, which is someone who owns the kit. So Iberdrola, for example, they do all the big wind farms. They will invest in your company by giving you all the smarts for the technology that you need for that site. And in exchange for that, they will ask for some equity in the project. That's also where you see innovation grants, and it's where you see some of the development the development money. So like the development bank monies and the European Union monies coming in. During development, you have pretty similar types of funding sources. And then you get into construction, where you have construction finance, which is typically debt finance. You have trade finance, which is people putting sweat equity in. So someone will supply all of the mechanical engineers for the site, and for that, they will get a part of the project. Commissioning, you carry on with your paying the bank to pay for the construction. And then in operation, because I said that's where your business model can be different, that's where you have different sources of money and different, the money going to different people dependent on how the project has been set up. So if you've come at this as a pure play provider, you've sold the project at the end of stage 4. In stage 5, the person who bought it from you is getting all the income from the project because they bought it from you, and they're paying themselves back. And then you'll see in decommissioning, that's when equity is paid out. So whatever's left in the project is sold, and that's distributed to the people who own the project. Lots and lots of different finance words. We'll question you at the end on how many of them you remember. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. So we've been looking at specific information on how projects are typically funded in Africa. And the report there that I'm referencing from Convergence is a very good source of information on where the money comes from and how it is used. And there's 2 slides that refer to that. So the blended finance that they're talking about, and they're saying we're seeing the rise of blended finance, which is the rise of the development funding and private capital. And private capital is quite often it's impact investors. We're starting to see green bonds coming in. We're seeing a lot of some private sector money coming in on that, as well as philanthropic organizations. And then the development funding is through the development agencies and the multi-donor agencies, as well as the multilateral development banks. So that's the African Development Bank and the World Bank. So we're starting to see combinations of these 2 types of funding building into blended finance structures through a number of projects on the African continent. So I would suggest that you look at that convergence report to get an idea of where those different types of money are mobilizing. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. And the other part of the finance is looking at how the money has been used. So has it been used to support capital? Has it been used? You can see here there's a fair piece of it that's gone to technical assistance. How is the money being used through the development of the project? And you'll see the design stage grant, the investment stage grant. There's a whole lot of different grant money that we're seeing going in, but then we're seeing equity and debt and guarantees, which is another form of debt coming in as well. So it does give you the spectrum of where the money is coming from and how companies are raising the cash they need to develop the projects. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. So what we were trying to work out is as you looked at these different funding sources, could you say that one or other of these funding sources is going to give you a more successful project? So should I be focusing on private equity to drive the renewable energy boom? Should I be focusing on development bank money to drive the renewable energy boom? What is the most effective source of money to drive these projects forward, especially given government money can be very difficult to trace? So is it better to look at private sector money in these projects because it's going to be easier to see what's happening? So I'm going to move on to the next slide. And just so when we talk about a project's bankability, that's when it's got to the end of the development stage and you've got your offtake ready to go, and the bank looks at it and says, yes, this project is well enough defined that I will lend it money. And the bankability of projects in Africa can be more challenging because the cost of debt in Africa is extremely high. And that's related to the credit rating of countries, the perceived and actual political policy and regulatory risk. So policy risk is if policy doesn't stay and is uncertain. Australia's had a huge policy risk for a long time. Risk is if regulations aren't properly or laws are not properly implemented. There's currency risk concerns. I mean, Zimbabwe's had some currency challenges, and just understanding where your exchange rate's going to sit over the 30-year life of the project could be a problem. And then in many instances, the renewable energy projects that we've been seeing are quite small. So it's companies would like a big chunk of money to take these forward, and a lot of them are too small for private sector money, and that's why we're seeing a lot of government money going into them. So to access this capital, we need to de-risk these things. We need to, in many ways, the focus is on collaboration, and that's why we're seeing this blended finance response is you need to have the government there to get rid of a lot of these risks I've described on the left-hand side, but the government pockets aren't deep enough, so you need to have the private sector in as well. So collaborating is getting rid of a lot of the risk and making the development banks, for example, be willing to support them. The provision of debt guarantees and quite often looking at insuring your debt is starting to drive change. So those are looking at more innovative ways to ensure or to promise to the person who's lent you the money, they will be able to get it back over the life of the project. This information I've included to help you think about some of the challenges, but also just to explain to you where these concepts might sit when you're looking at a framework for, is this a good project? Moving on to the next slide, please. But there are other things that can impact bankability. And a lot of it's about the confidence of your investors and how they see what's happening to them and what's happening around the project. So understanding if you do sign contracts on a project, and if you have a change in regime or you have a change in government in the state, will those projects still be honored, especially if your off-taker is government? So remember I said right at the beginning, got to have an off-taker for your project. If you don't have an off-taker, your project won't survive. So understanding whether those projects or those contracts will stand, even if you have a change in regime. The financial standing of the monopolistic grid infrastructure owner operators. So that is, for Southern Africa, it's Eskom, because Eskom manages the grid. And if you have a challenge with both the grid being maintained, but also if Eskom is increasingly challenged and starting financially challenged, it's a problem for you because you might not be able to connect your project to the grid. So having that grid be robust and safe is very important. Market access is also important. So how easy is it to sell electricity outside of the electricity market? The more ways that you can sell your electricity, the more ways you can get income, and the easier it is to build the projects. And there are concerns about corruption, especially on grants and philanthropic sources where they're not taking equity, they're not taking a stake, they're not asking to be paid back. They want to see their money go to the right place. So concerns about corruption are more significant for some sources of money. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. So we've included this slide just to wrap up all of the different sources of money. As I said, there's debt, which is when you borrow money, and it's can be in support of the project. It can be it can be from specific project funders. It can be corporate finance, and we're seeing a lot of money coming from the green bond market at the moment, and that is a source of money that Africa should look at, because there's not that much space to develop renewable energy projects in Europe, and it will be cheaper to develop them in other countries. There's grants, as we've heard about today, and there's equity. So that's different types of bodies putting IP or hours or technical skills into your company, and they get a piece of your company back as a result. Sources of debt: private banks, government banks, foreign governments, and the development banks. All of them can have different stipulations on what needs to happen with money. I mean, the case that always comes back to me is when the World Bank lent money to Mosal, to the aluminium smelter in Mozambique. They were very specific about what percentage of the employees at the smelter needed to come from the local economy, and because of that, a university was built to support the provision of domestic skills. So the stipulations that particularly those bi- and multilateral development agencies and banks put on loans can make a huge difference to the co-benefits associated with projects. There are other instruments which are often underused, and this is where you can it can be very innovative. There's things around credit guarantees and insurances, and that I'm not going to get into in detail today. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. So as I said, the development banks, for example, look for different things when they invest money in a project. And so the different outcomes are typically sourced by different types of money. So commercial and private sector finance are looking for a high return on their investment. They usually are happier to take risk, but they are looking for higher returns. They have a shorter investment scenario. So they're looking at a lower risk tolerance because they don't have the balance sheets to pay for huge risk. And their ESG priorities are typically set by the person who's buying the electricity. So quite often your private sector finance isn't worried about co-benefits associated with the project, but the person who's buying the renewable energy might be specific about the co-benefits that they're looking for. Public sector, so government money or development money, they are usually much better at looking at what the co-benefits of the project are. So local content, job creation, are we using local money and looking at enhancing local capabilities and skills? And there are as many different co-benefits as there are ESG considerations. A lot, yeah, you can build really, really interesting things into projects if you think about what you want from the project at the beginning. And maybe that's something we can discuss in question time. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So, I mean, ultimately, what does a good project look like? If I'm going to look at a renewable energy project and I'm going to say, I'm going to give it a mark out of 10, how would I go about assessing that? So from my perspective, you need to understand where the money's gone to, how it's been spent, and can you account for all of it? From a project perspective, did it meet its time specifications, and is it delivering the energy output that it said it would? And I think that that's a consideration for the biomass project, which is you've got two segments there. You've got the people who wouldn't have had electricity before, and then the people who are displacing their electricity consumption. Are both of their electricity needs being met by having those biomass projects there? The social license to operate, do people like it? I mean, ultimately, it is about how cross are the local people, or is the project well liked and well regarded? Has it got people offside, or is it part of the fabric of the community? And then on the co-benefit side, what was promised, what was said about skilling up the local community, investing money in the local community, enabling the local community to maintain their project, what was promised and what was delivered, and has it really lived up to what it said on the label? I want to move on to the next slide, please. So I do have some case studies, but I just want to check in with you, Lelo, if you think there is time or if you think it's better to go to some questions now.
I think there's still time. Then we can go for questions after.
So what we did was we unpacked, if we can move on to the next slide, please. We unpacked what's been happening in South Africa and how the renewable energy projects have been proposed and how many of them are actually moving forward. So we looked at the approval process, we looked at who pays the generators, we looked at how many markets exist to sell the output, the revenue options, as well as the financing structures and the outcomes. So if we're looking at how do you assess a good project, this is a framework that you can look at applying to the projects to see how they're going. Moving forward. So this is just looking at the South African Renewable Energy Procurement Program. It's a state-controlled, I mean, you know, Eskom, there's the monopoly distribution and generation. How electricity is sold, it's sold through the municipalities at the local government level. Under the renewable energy program, they had to, if you put in a plant that was below 100 megawatt hours, you could operate without a license. I know the new rules are going to reduce that to, I think, 1 megawatt hour. But the only person you could sell the power to was Eskom or the government. So you couldn't propose a renewable energy project and go and look for someone other than Eskom or the government who was going to pay you more for your power. You had to sell your electricity to Eskom. Participation in tenders was run by the state only, and it wasn't possible for the private sector to engage with how they were going to sell their power. There were no subsidies. There were no feed-in tariffs then, and the program participants were underwritten by private and development finance institutions. So we did start seeing some of the blended finance there. This is looking out to the last round after the initial 3 rounds. There have been a number of projects announced, but we haven't seen many of them being delivered. And there's absolutely been a loss of momentum. And I assume that the announcements made a couple of days ago is going to drive momentum in the program. I think I will just talk to that now. So essentially the changes that have been made to the program are the big one from the perspective of paying for or financing projects is that you will be able to sell your power to anyone. So you will be able to, in the South African market, essentially start building a power purchase agreement where you develop the renewable energy project. The electricity does feed through the grid, but you are paid directly for your electricity by the off-taker, and it doesn't have to go through Eskom or through the government. So there will be, the potential does exist now to really change how renewable energy projects are developed and paid for in Southern Africa. And as we know, all of the countries around Southern Africa do to some extent import electricity from the Eskom grid. So what happens in the Eskom grid is profoundly important to everyone in Southern Africa. And the potential does exist even for big renewable or for offtake in Botswana or Zimbabwe to pay for a development in Southern Africa and feed it through the Eskom grid and maintain grid integrity and still grid connectivity, not having to have an off-grid renewables project.